The North Atlantic is a place of phantom shapes and silence. It is a world where the line between the sea and the sky is often erased by fog, and where one wrong turn can mean you never come home. For the crew of the Northern Swan, it was supposed to be a routine morning off the coast of Labrador. Mallory Harrigan was at the wheel, her boyfriend Cliff Russell and their crewmate Alan Russell on deck. They were seasoned fishers who knew these waters by heart. But that morning, the silence felt heavy, the kind of quiet that sits on the water before something changes. And then, the fog broke. Miles from shore, a pale, jagged shape rose from the deep, a mushroom-shaped iceberg drifting on the current. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a hazard to avoid. Cliff pointed it out, and Mallory slowed the engine, keeping a safe distance. But as the boat drifted closer, the gray curtain of mist lifted just enough to reveal something none of them expected. It wasn't the ice that stopped them cold. It was what was stranded on top of it. At first, they thought it was a seal. That would have been standard. Seals rest on ice floes all the time in these waters. But as the Northern Swan inched closer, the silhouette didn't look right. It wasn't slick or sprawled. It was hunched, matted, and shivering violently. This wasn't a seal. It was a land animal, miles from the nearest shore, stranded on a slab of ice that was slowly breaking apart beneath it. It was an Arctic fox. The crew stared in disbelief. Arctic foxes are resilient survivors of the tundra, built to endure brutal cold on land, but they are not creatures of the open ocean. It didn't take long to piece together what had likely happened. Driven by hunger, the fox had probably ventured onto shore ice in search of food, only for a section to crack off and drift out to sea. Now it was marooned, soaked by freezing spray, exhausted and starving. The ice was shrinking with every wave, and there was nothing but open ocean in every direction. Mallory knew they had a choice to make. They could note the location, continue their work, and let nature take its course, or they could try something that had almost no chance of working. They chose to try, but the fox didn't understand they were there to help. As the boat approached, the terrified animal scrambled to the far edge of the ice, its claws scraping against the slick surface, slipping dangerously close to the water. It was wild, panicked, and running out of energy fast. The crew tried to keep calm, but the wind swallowed their voices. The fox was cornered by circumstance. If it stayed on the ice, exhaustion and exposure would eventually take it. If it bolted into the water, its saturated fur would drag it down before long. They couldn't simply reach out and grab a terrified wild animal. So Mallory came up with a plan, one that went against every cautious instinct she had as a boat captain. They were going to use the boat to break the ice apart. The idea was to fracture the floe, putting the fox into the water for just long enough to scoop it out with a dip net. It was risky. If they couldn't get the net under it quickly enough, the fox would be in serious trouble, waterlogged, panicked, and sinking. Mallory throttled forward. Cliff and Alan stood ready at the rail, nets in hand. The boat struck. The ice fractured, and the fox plunged into the brutal, freezing North Atlantic. For a heartbeat, it vanished beneath the surface. Then, a small, wet head broke through, paddling in frantic, desperate circles. Alan lunged with the net. He missed. The boat drifted. The fox was struggling, its heavy, waterlogged fur pulling it lower with every second. Alan swept the net again. Deeper this time. He felt the weight. He pulled. A wet, shivering heap landed on the wooden deck. They had it. The fox was too exhausted to run. It lay there, panting, eyes wide, trembling from cold and shock. Underneath the soaked fur, the animal was alarmingly thin, little more than bones. Mallory quickly set up a makeshift shelter using a crate lined with dry bedding and moved the fox out of the biting wind. But rescue is only the first step. Survival requires warmth and food, and the fox wasn't interested in eating. The crew offered cheese and crackers, the only thing they had on hand. The fox ignored them completely. It was shutting down. Then Cliff dug through the galley supplies and found a tin of Vienna sausages. He cracked the lid. The smell of processed meat drifted through the cold air. For the first time since the rescue, the fox lifted its head. It took a cautious bite, then another. Then it devoured the entire tin. With food in its belly and a dry place to rest, the shaking gradually stopped. The little fox curled into a tight ball and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep as the Northern Swan turned toward shore. They couldn't keep a wild Arctic fox, but they also weren't going to drop it just anywhere. The crew headed for a small, uninhabited island nearby, a place with freshwater, ground-nesting birds, and enough small prey to support a fox. When they went ashore, they noticed an old abandoned doghouse sitting near the rocks, a remnant from some past use of the island. Whether it would serve as shelter or be ignored entirely was up to the fox, but it was there. Cliff and Alan carried the crate to solid ground. They unlatched the door and stepped back. The fox hesitated at the edge of the crate. For a brief moment, it looked back at the crew, the strangers who had chased it, dunked it, and fed it canned sausages from their lunch supply. Then it shook its fur out, fluffing back up against the wind, and trotted steadily into the brush without looking back again. As the crew motored away, the fog began to roll in once more, drawing its curtain back across the water. In the weeks that followed, whenever the northern swan passed that island, the crew made a point of scanning the shore, and more than once they spotted it, a flash of white fur moving through the rocks. Healthy, alert, alive. They had pulled a life from the ocean that the sea had no intention of giving back. Out here, the water is cold and indifferent. It doesn't care what it takes, but sometimes a crew on a fishing boat decides to care enough for both. The crew of the Northern Swan risked their boat and their mourning for a wild animal that would never understand what they did. Some might call that foolish. Others might call it the most human thing you can do. Where do you draw that line? Tell us in the comments. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories from the water coming soon. Thanks for watching.